Hi, everybody. That was obviously a very bleak way to begin this. So I'm going to try to bring the mood a little bit back up, even given what it is that we're here talking about tonight. So thank you for coming. We've got two panelists here who know a lot about the death penalty and from really different angles. They've both been kind of insiders and outsiders. First, Estelle Hebron-Jones has represented people who are facing the death penalty, worked for two of really the most important organizations doing that work in the country. One is the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. The other is the Texas Defender Service. And then Richard Linklater, longtime filmmaker. Some of you probably know his work. Among his films is this one, Hometown Prison, which it doesn't come up in this clip, but is sort of occasioned by the fact that Linklater grew up in Huntsville, Texas, and so was sort of around these people. Fred Allen, this executioner you just met, they were schoolmates in high school. They played football together. So he has a kind of intimate glance, but it's a sort of a sideways one. Before we start talking, I just want to set the table a little bit. I wrote a book about the death penalty that came out about 4 years ago, and there were some things in that research that really surprised me and that kind of help us understand the big picture. A big one is that I think people associate Texas and the death penalty as this sort of timeless thing, right? That we've had the death penalty forever, we'll always have it, it's baked into our culture. And I learned that that is not really true. The death penalty pretty much disappeared across the entire United States, including Texas, in the 60s. The Supreme Court forced state lawmakers in a number of states to rewrite their death penalty laws. That took place in the 70s. And then you really see this rise of death sentences and executions up through the 80s and into the 90s. This was an era where Texas started to become very culturally associated with the death penalty. I just found a clip recently of Phil Hartman from Saturday Night Live, if everybody remembers him, playing a fictional Texas governor and doing a campaign ad while sitting on a stack of coffins, right? It was this like very dark gallows humor era. And death sentences, executions sort of peaked 99, 2000, and then really have been on a long, slow slide since then. So some numbers to just understand what we're talking about is that since the 70s, there have been about 1,600 executions in the United States, and about 600 of those, so a bit more than a third, were in Texas. But another thing to sort of note was that in 1996, in the US, 300 people, more than 300 people were sentenced to death in courtrooms, and last year that number was 26. So there's been a huge decline. There were 40 executions in Texas in the year 2000, and last year there were just 5, right? So things have actually changed. It's a lot more of a dynamic picture, I think, than one might assume. And it's also, I think we all have a sense that it's not quite as central to our politics anymore as it once was, and we can talk about that a bit. But it is still there. It's something Donald Trump, as president, talks about quite a bit. There were some recent executive orders around the death penalty, sort of an effort to ramp it up again. So with that in mind, I guess we can begin, Estelle, with talking about just this kind of question of what is your sense of why Texas has been such an epicenter of this compared with other states, including other states that you've worked in?
I think, as you just said, I think Texas has really wanted to stick to this idea, this whole like Texas tough idea. It's now kind of part of the culture of things. I think that it's part of Texas setting itself as a, we're a state, but a state that makes its own decisions. The death penalty has always been linked to this states' rights kind of issue, and so being able to being a state where it is used much more than many other states has been a symbol of reinforcing those states' rights. Now, I also worked in Alabama, which is another state which is very active death penalty state, but it's different in terms of its, when people think of the poorest states, for example, you're always going to hear Alabama come up as one of those. And population-wise, you wouldn't think that it would have a large death row, but considering its population, actually, it does. And I think that for like Alabama, for example, it's a way of Alabama trying to reinforce itself as being independent and being able to choose its own destiny by having the death penalty and being a very active death penalty state. There are some things legally there that make it different. So, In Alabama, they had something called judicial override, which was something that existed until 2017, where even if a jury decided that someone shouldn't get the death penalty, a judge could override that decision and say that the person could get death. And that's something that, so while it doesn't happen anymore, it wasn't when it was in 2017 when it was made, when it was taken off the books, it wasn't retroactive. So there's still people on Alabama's death row who have death sentences for that reason, a significant number. In Alabama also, the funding for death penalty cases comes from the state, while versus here, each county is going to be in charge of that funding. So it's just a way you can see how politics and states' rights and that image affects how the death penalty is administered here. As in Texas, even though you can see how it's different in each county, because like most death sentences in Texas, the most executed, most currently on death row, most have been sentenced to death, all come from Harris County. So you see from, based on the size of county or kind of the attitude of a county, maybe more death sentences coming from there. There's certain counties where they've never sent anyone to death row, or counties where it might be one person, for example. So those are some of the differences I've seen. There are many other things, but.
Yeah, well, and when we talk about judges in Alabama, for example, having an incredible amount of power, my understanding of Texas is that a lot of this power resides in the elected district attorney, right? So who is elected? For example, in Travis County, here in Austin, the current district attorney, Jose Garza, is really set himself up as a bit of an opponent of the death penalty, is not actively seeking death sentences. Has it been your sense that that these politics have changed at sort of the local level over the years?
Oh yeah, definitely. So yeah, Travis County is a great example of that, where it's generally when it comes to how people get charged, prosecutorial discretion is a big part of that. But what we're seeing now is that from the top, the top DA is having a big role in directing that. Now, in response to that, that means that there are now these other layers of politics involved, where now we even have there's the division between the AG's office, who gets involved in capital cases at different stages, and now with the current Trump presidency, we're seeing the influence of the president kind of trying to seep into what's happening in the states and then the counties. So yeah, that's a huge factor. They set the mission of what's happening in the courtrooms. And I do think that, for example, the election of Jose Garza is an example of how people really are taking into account those views on the death penalty, or views on how to pursue specific charges affect elections and their outcomes.
Rick,
can I
ahead.
say on the that question of why so many in Texas? There was an old Texas politician, this is decades ago, when asked that question of why so much, he just says, well, we just got more people who need killing.
Baked into the cultural fabric, in a sense. Was that something that first I should say, your film, it's interesting, watching it I thought to myself, oh, he set out to make a movie about his hometown, and that just inevitably is a film about prisons and the death penalty. But was it chicken or egg? How did that develop?
Yeah, well, it started in the film, and I don't want to bore you if you haven't seen it, but I had that footage from a long time ago, almost 20 years ago, the Delma Banks execution that went right up to the last minute. I just went there and just started filming, not knowing what I'd find, but I had become more and more anti-death penalty. I grew up there, but when I lived there, and I say this in the movie, in just my whole childhood, death penalty was a thing of the past. It was this kind of barbaric thing we had moved beyond from another era. But as a kid, you're still kind of, it's like, oh, old Sparky, where they, electrocuted, the electric chair. And then, you're just kind of fascinated with it. Guillotines. California has the, gas chamber, and it was just kind of wow. But it was a thing of the past. But I remember, like in the 70s, Supreme Court ruling, it comes back. Remember the Gary Gilmore, that was a kind of a high profile. And it took Texas a while. We were like 5 or 6 years into that before we executed our first person. But then when we did, it really jumped into gear. And yeah, the next decade was It was so extensive. So I started paying attention there. And I remember even as a teenager, when it was back in high school civics class or something, you debate team kind of stuff, pro-death penalty, anti-death penalty. It was a good issue to really mix it up, because it is a fascinating, very deep, complex issue that you can argue from every possible vantage point. I remember, I think I ended on a debate team, like we had to do pro-death penalty. I remember feeling okay about that as a 16, 17-year-old. But seeing how kind of, how it's dispersed, even the stats you're talking about, that your county, if you could see, let's just say, people doing horrible things that deserve the death penalty are kind of, you would think would be spread out amongst the population. But if you look where it happens, it's just a few counties, definitely a few states. That's kind of, sounds pretty arbitrary, doesn't it? It seems kind of random, let's say. So that just right there, to me, says, and then once you get into the cases and the details of it, how stacked it is against the defendants, how just, I don't know, it's just so brutally, just my own sense of justice just said, okay, no, that's a loser. Yes, there's some horrible people in the world who've done horrible things, but it's just such a random, arbitrary, unfair system that, so anyway. And then as I got older, I started meeting more. That was just my youthful, viewpoint. But I got older and a little more involved, and I just knew a lot of people who do, what you do, Estelle, and people who are around it a little closer. I grew up with guys who, it was close to me, and I just saw the pain it caused.
Can you talk a little bit more about the ripple effects? Because I think that's one of the
you just saw it with my high school buddy here. My high school football team, I had one teammate died on death row. I had guys who became wardens, a ton of guys who ended up corrections officers, and a lot of guys on my team ended up in prison. I think it's like if you grew up in the steel mill town, it just sort of attracts you. The prison sort of attracted. I had a stepfather who was a prison guard, had another stepfather who was in prison. So I was just around it. So I was always kind of paying attention to it. So. But I've been more and more, even though it's going in this direction, it's a lot more life without parole, and there's a lot of sentencing options. And I'm glad to see that happening, but it's still happening. Of the 5 people we did last year, certainly Yvonne Cantu was, I think, either innocent or deserved a new trial. So now I think we're executing innocent people with kind of a shrug. That was always the bugaboo, right? It'd be like, ooh, what if we ever executed someone who was innocent? Oh, that's never happened. But if it did, it would be the end of, like Anton Scalia was like, oh, he shout it from the rooftops. But, it's kind of happening. It's happened in Texas clearly. And when the Cantu thing a year ago, I was amazed at how little publicity. So anyway, I agree. It's like, why wasn't that on CNN? Why wasn't that on the news? Why aren't people, it's like, oh, it's going away. So should we forget about it and just wait for it to die a natural death? Or should we speak up? I don't know.
What's your sense of why people have grown more apathetic to it?
I guess you just kind of get worn down with an issue. It just doesn't seem to change much. And to hear that the death sentence is being kind of handed out a lot less. Maybe you think it's improving, and I think that is a good sign. But nonetheless, I don't know. I don't know if it would go away. Biden didn't even do it at the federal level. He did it for everybody but a few people, right?
Right.
Dylan Roof and a couple of the worst. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Estelle, I want to talk a little bit about what is it actually involved in representing someone who's been sentenced to death. I think there are certain narratives that, I don't know, people maybe assume based on films that, you walk in and there's the plexiglass and everyone says they're innocent and or they're trying to manipulate you somehow. What are the kind of common, I guess, how would you describe it in a general way? And if you want to sort of tell any specific stories, what are the kind of misconceptions about representing people in this position?
Yeah, so with the work that I've done, it's mostly been appeals and post-conviction work. Well, actually, no, pretty much all of it. So I don't do trial work. So it's always people who they've already been sentenced. They're already in prison. And so starting out from there, my clients are people who they've had a bad experience with the legal system, whether that's just the fact that they've been sentenced to death, or their experience in the courtroom, or their experience with lawyers in the past. And sometimes I'm coming into cases like at the appeal stage, so I'll be their next lawyer after they've been sentenced, or it could be further down. So they've gone through state post-conviction, they've had federal habeas lawyers. So that's the first part, that they've had some kind of experience related to their conviction and their sentence already. And then along with that, I've never had a case where someone hasn't experienced just immense amounts of trauma prior to the offense that led them to their conviction and their sentencing. So that's the first thing to think about, is that those are who the clients are. And then when it comes to actually working on the cases, depending on the kind of case, what we're doing is we're not just looking for issues of innocence. Innocence isn't always going to be the issue that you're looking at in a case. And I've never really had a case where the first thing they say is, I'm innocent. Like, that's not really what you're coming in to do at that point. Sometimes it is. So you're looking through the records, you're investigating, looking for those issues, but you're also looking for issues related to intellectual disability, looking to see if their previous lawyers did the full type of investigation that should be done, whether that's the facts and forensics, or whether that's in their social history, really researching the mitigation issue, working with mitigation specialists, working with experts to put together or to find issues that exist in a case. And it's rare to not have a case, or to have a case where you don't find any of those issues. So with all the cases that I'm working on, it depends on it, like when it's further along, I'm dealing with a larger volume of records to look through, and so that's part of the reason why some of these cases also take so long, is because you just have so much you have to go through, and often you're re-investigating things that have already been investigating, because that's the only way you're going to be able to find out whether everything that should have been done has been done. You're working to gather a team of experts and people who are able to assist you in really figuring out all the issues, because I'm a lawyer. While I know some stuff about DNA, I don't know everything I need to do to find out. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist or a neuropsychologist, so we're doing a lot of work to identify people that can work with us to help put together strong claims in court.
You mentioned just in passing the role of a mitigation specialist, which is one I think I have come to find very interesting, and I'm just wondering if you can describe what that is.
Yeah, so actually one of my colleagues in mitigation is Miranda, who's a mitigation specialist. She's here. So at Texas Defender Service, we take on cases at different stages, so appeal, post-conviction, and so we're lawyers, but we also have a team of mitigation specialists who are really, most of them, their background is in social work, but you don't have to be a social worker to do it. And they investigate the person's life, just like top to bottom, finding, talking to family members, talking to teachers, talking to friends, and they have this ability to put together just like a narrative and a timeline of this person's life, which can show that they're not just the offense they might have been charged with or convicted of. Because in a capital trial, what happens, you have the first part where someone is found guilty or innocent, and if they're found guilty, you move on to, it's like basically a whole other trial on whether there's enough mitigating evidence, so evidence showing that this person is not deserving of a death sentence, where you put all the evidence on. You will have experts, you'll have family members, and then the state in turn will have maybe someone talking about the prison environment and whether someone will be dangerous there, because the jury has to make a decision on whether in Texas, the person will be a future danger, and then if there's enough mitigation to overcome a death sentence. So in so when the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty, one of the things that they said is that states have to create a mechanism for juries to basically consider mitigation. And so out of that, so I think in any case, mitigation should be something that should exist. In a death penalty case, it's like a very specific thing that has to be presented. And so this kind of area emerged where these experts and being able to develop that have been a critical role players in death penalty trials, and even before preventing death penalty trials from even happening. That's actually where they do a lot of their work that you don't get to hear about because there isn't a death penalty trial that happens. But mitigation is I think it's like one of the key things that prevents people from getting death sentences.
But does that happen right after the conviction? Is it close, or is it?
So
like, where do you enter if someone has already been convicted, like you said?
As a lawyer for mitigation?
Yeah, does a different team come in and do mitigation instead of the public defender who represented them? Yeah,
Usually you would want mitigation to that investigation to be happening before trial and during trial, and even though it's something that has to be presented, I think that there's still a misunderstanding of what's the standard that needs to be met for a really complete mitigation investigation. So some of what we at TDS are doing is helping to also educate some of those lawyers who are representing people in capital trials to actually know what they have to do and know the expertise of mitigation specialists.
The commonality I see almost always is, well, obviously they're very poor, and the second is they have a really bad defense, who, usually a public defender.
At the front stage, yeah.
Yeah, in your initial trial, and then after your death penalty conviction, here comes better legal help. But it's hard to undo that sometimes.
Don't knock public defenders. I think there's some really, really great public defenders.
I know,
but
I'm saying,
actually,
I have friends who are public defenders, I'm not saying.
But actually most people don't get represented by public defenders in Texas. They get appointed attorneys.
They get appointed attorneys, yeah.
And so their incentives are
different.
And
it's the wrong word I used. I'm not a lawyer, but yeah, appointed, that's even worse. You'd rather have someone who's dedicated their life to public defense. There's a kind of a connection to that as public good versus we're going to throw you a case because you know.
And there were a handful of scandals. When I had started researching my book, I knew that there was a famous case where the defense lawyer had fallen asleep during the trial.
A lot of sleeping in trials.
And then I got into the research and started to confuse myself, like, oh, am I mixing up these two cases? Oh no, actually there were 3 different ones where the lawyer fell asleep, but this was actually like 3 makes a pattern,
But that's not, it's not bad.
But then you do not uncommonly, just the way that these things have developed over the years, have a organization like the Texas Defender Service or Equal Justice Initiative sort of tend to come in after the conviction and death sentence, after the person's maybe been on death row, maybe even coming in at the point at which it's an emergency because there's an execution date that's been set, right? And so then, there were stories in the 90s of the men on death row writing letters to try to get a lawyer to jump in on the case. What you frequently hear from the other side, from prosecutors and from victim family members, is that lawyers are basically using any tactic they can to delay the execution. They're kind of throwing wrenches, coming up with claims sort of out of nowhere that there were 20 years that have gone by and all of a sudden this great evidence of innocence emerges at the 11th hour. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what would be your response, I suppose, to someone who says that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a response that I expect, and the things that with these cases that have been sometimes going through the courts for a long time, it's true that it's sometimes going to be that the attorneys that were on the case previously, either maybe they didn't have the resources to investigate well enough, and these issues of innocence do appear later on. There can be issues where maybe there's a witness who, for some reason or other, they were not accessible at the time. There's changes in science that affect how you might look at certain pieces of evidence later on. But directly to respond to you're just trying to throw something in here last minute. I think, don't we, if there is a chance that someone is innocent, do we want to say, well, it doesn't matter if it's last minute? Like, no, we want to stop that if we can. And so I think what we do, yes, of course, it's representing people and trying to get the best outcome for them, but we're also trying to test the system and make sure that it's working effectively. And if you don't have people if you have people who will just let claims slide through because they're scared of getting a response about, this is why are you bringing this here last minute? It's like, that's what we do. And, either consider these issues on the merits or not, but we'd rather present them than have them go by and have someone get executed without it ever coming to light.
Yeah, I see a lot of DAs, county by county. It feels kind of predatory in a certain way. If they have a case they think they can get a death penalty, they'll go for it. Like a lot of similar crimes, or most people did do the terrible act, but why do some get the death penalty and some get 30 years or life? That seems like a grab bag of emotion. Someone's running for re-election. You never know what the
well, I mean, I think
the
it kind
things
of
are that say, okay, I think I can get the death penalty here. It's usually someone who's really vulnerable. It doesn't have, a well-to-do person with a good lawyer has never been. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
have they? I mean, whatever. So it just seems they get to kind of pick who they want to. You could do a lot of death penalty cases. Why are they picking that one? So to me, that starts to get like, oh, there's a child dead. So, I can get a conviction because I can emotionally manipulate people to make them think they killed, so.
I mean, a big piece of this story, I think that we have not talked about very much, but is a sort of massive part of the death penalty story, I think, to me, is the family members of victims. They are frequently the one whom a prosecutor, a district attorney, or the governor is responding to. I mean, during the first Trump administration, there were 13 federal executions, under the AG Barr, and but I remember Barr made these public statements to the effect of, "This is for the victim family members. They have waited long enough for justice. They desire." Usually hear words like closure, finality, right? I, in my interviews over the years with victim family members, have really seen the entire range. I've seen the people who witnessed the execution and said, I got out of that something meaningful to me. I got to close a chapter on my life. It was a positive emotional experience. The other end, I've had people say, it added to my trauma. It was worse. I regret having wanted that, and I regret having seen that. And you have people who are apathetic. You have people who don't want the death penalty sort of in their name, so to speak. I'm curious, either of you, whether making the film or in this representation, sort of how you've come to think about victim family members and their role in this process.
That's always the thing, and I've met them, interviewed them, and it is that gamut. It's kind of surprising. We all think that would justify it, but I've met a lot of people who, they know that won't bring them back. Sometimes they, in a way, get to know I'm a film guy, so I'm going to pitch 2 films. There's a short film you can stream right now called I Am Ready, Warden. I don't know if any of you heard about it. It was at the Oscars last night. It was nominated for Best Short Film documentary. And it's wonderful because it really shows 2 sides. This guy does this horrible murder in Corpus Christi as a teenager, escapes to Mexico, comes back, and his son was a teenager at that time, but now he's in his 30s, and they're about to execute the guy who did it. And you get to know both people, and they kind of, you sense their relationship, and you're with both of them. You're at the execution, and you're with the son of the murdered, the guy who suffered the tragedy. And it's really telling, he was kind of all for it, all along. And then at the end, he's kind of crying, saying, we murdered that guy. I didn't, So, I don't know. It's intense, but you're really supposed to. Isn't that why it's the state against the person? There's another film I'll suggest if you haven't seen it already. The State of Texas versus Melissa. You can stream that on Hulu, and it's about the Melissa Lucio. You know, I think undoubtedly innocent, but near execution, you know, the back and forth. But you get into her case, it illustrates a lot of what I'm saying, the arbitrary nature, the bad defense, the terrible science, you know, just a really bad case.
Well, I think her case also illuminates a thing people don't maybe necessarily think about on its face, which is that plenty of death penalty cases involve a murder, not most, but some number of them involve a murder within a family or a death within a family. So a parent, for example, who is accused of killing their own child. So Melissa Lucio is one, Robertson, the case that really made the news last year.
Yeah.
I remember Dr. Phil testified at the Texas legislature over it, which really stuck out to me as odd. We haven't talked so much about how much Kim Kardashian and Dr. Phil seem to be sort of on these cases sometimes, but
it's always
they retain something.
Same people. But you know, Yvonne Cantu is accused of killing his cousin.
Right.
And
so it just raises this issue that sometimes the victim family and the perpetrator family are the same family, right?
Yeah.
And so the dynamics are much more complex even than the already complex sort of baseline emotions. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to share about the victim family piece.
Yeah, no, I think, like as Rick said, it's the state versus the person. It's not the family versus that person. And then when you look at the fact that for example, the race of a victim plays a role in who ends up getting sentenced to death and who gets executed. If we emphasize the victim's family in these decisions, it's almost then adding this layer. Does it mean that we think certain victims are more deserving of justice? So you know, I think that so it's not to invalidate that, and I understand the personal feeling of wanting like retribution, but when it comes to the legal system and what it's supposed to be doing and who it's supposed to be representing, I think we need to look more broadly than that, because otherwise then we're just reinforcing the discrimination that we see in the punishments that people are getting.
Yeah, I mean the statistics speak for themselves, you know.
Around racial discrimination?
Yeah, it's obvious, you know, like a white victim and a black, you know.
Yeah, no, and certainly what I've seen is that there are disparities in who gets the death penalty, but a disparity that I think is, my understanding, is much more extreme, is in who the race of the victim, right? That if your victim is black, the person is less likely, just all else equal, to receive the death penalty than if the victim is white, right? I think we should go to audience questions. We have time for about 10, 15 minutes of questions. And Sarah over here has a microphone, and I'll sort of point out. So please raise your hand and I'll send her over. I want to ask that for the question and answer session to sort of emphasize the word question in there. Because we've all been at this panel where speeches get made. And
the 5-minute
we
question.
have all had not the best time with that. So just keep your fellow panel goers in mind before you make a speech. In the back right here.
In a way, it's not really a question, but
Already violent.
That's a good first question.
the subject is, though, I was sort of surprised to feel that there's people out there like yourselves and others that are doing what you're doing to, make things, right to some extent. So thank you.
You do your part, when you're, whatever you can in this world, right? So, and you, when the Yvonne Cantu thing was happening, I gave when I showed this at Sundance, that was happening, and I got a call from Sister Helen Prasheen. She goes, I said, we talked about Yvonne. I made a little video, kind of a ad. You just do everything you can. It didn't help. It makes it even more personal, terrible when it happens. But you just some things activate you, more. So.
Yeah. In the yellow, there's two actually question askers in yellow. So the one in the back and then the one in the front.
Oh, a lot of yellow.
Yes, your thoughts on the recent Shaken Baby case, which was held back and still, I don't think he's been executed yet, but what's the thoughts on that?
So when you
Robert
refer to-
Roberson?
Yeah, that got a lot of.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that has to do with so there's a junk science law here in Texas that was supposed to help people who could present new science. And I think so his case is an example of how the law doesn't really work for everyone. So actually Texas Defender Service, we put out a report about the law 11073 came out in July last year. It's just an example of how there needs to be better review of what's happening in these cases. There are lots of people who are filing things that aren't getting reviewed, that aren't being given an opportunity to have their cases even looked at. And some of the breakdown in I think what's happening here in Texas is in the CCA not adequately reviewing these cases, especially when there's a lot of strong evidence there. As for what's going to happen, who knows? I think right now there's this kind of battle between kind of the legislative power and then the court power, and then of course not wanting to. I think one of the things not wanting to open the floodgates to people. I think is I'm not a judge, but I can see from their perspective, wanting to make sure you have they want something narrow so that they have some, I guess, control over how they can look at other cases in the future. So, but it's concerning to a lot of us.
And I just want to, for those who don't know, Robert Roberson was nearly executed last year for the murder of his 2-year-old daughter. He took her into the hospital, and scientists at the time, or sort of the doctors who looked at her, evaluated it to be shaken baby syndrome. In the years since that conviction and death sentence, while he's been on death row, the science has shifted such that there's sort of more questions about what it is that causes some of the symptoms that they saw in this child, right? And so there's a kind of a reevaluation that gives at least credence to his claims that he did not kill his daughter, right? And this case for me sort of highlights also just an essential tension, I think, that surrounds the death penalty, and particularly questions of people's innocence when there are these sort of forensic questions, which is that we all know that science changes over time, right? That the way we understood DNA 40 years ago is not the way we understand DNA today. The way we understand the science of arson and fires is different than it used to be. And death sentences and executions are like the most final thing we can do. And so there's just a tension there that there's sort of no way around.
But it's also kind of, we live in this, if you're a prosecutor, if you in law and there's a dead baby, no one wants to say, well, it just happened. You have to, I think they project a lot of intentionality on it, often on the parents. Melissa Lucio, same thing. She's got 12 kids. She's never beat any of them. She's a good mom. She has problems. But her kid falls down the stairs and it's like, no, you beat your kid. And the science is, there's bruises, they have pictures, and it's very emotional, but they don't want to admit, like, the kid fell down the stairs or one of the siblings did it. What's the incentive? Most people, unless you have severe mental illness, most people don't naturally want to kill their kids, it's not a natural thing. So, but if it's there, I don't know, it happens a lot. I mentioned that earlier, kids, because it just happens a lot.
Well, when a child
there has to be a person behind the act. No one wants to admit bad things just happen. There's accidents, and that's not enough. we need a face to the, we need to punish somebody for this tragedy. So that happens a lot. I
Up in
think.
the front.
Rick, I'm wondering when and or where we can see your movie. Is it already out?
This one, yeah, it's on HBO.
Okay,
HBO Max.
great.
Look under. It's a series about Texas called God Save Texas. It's one of 3 documentaries about our state. There's one about the border, one about mine's kind of about the criminal justice, and then one about the energy industry.
Okay, do you plan to show it at Austin Film Society?
I think we showed it about a year ago.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Where were you? Yeah.
I don't know, 'cause I live at that theater. Okay, thank you.
No, it's okay. It's like everything. It's available. It's streamable. It's on. You can find it.
Right down the middle to the right. Sorry if my pointing's a little rude. Yeah.
This is for Miss Hebron-Jones. Could you give us just kind of a Cliff's Notes of the details of the law of the death penalty in Texas right now, like how it works and what the process is?
In 90 seconds or less.
Oh wow,
That's a big
that's a
question.
big one.
You would want the public to understand about kind of how this big important thing works in Texas.
Still a big question, but I think, so it won't 100% answer your question, but, going back to how the death penalty works. So, there's murder, and usually death penalty is going to be murder and something else. Usually, it could be rape, arson, death of a correctional officer, something like that. In every state, they might have something, it will be different. Most of the things will be the same, but every once in a while, there'll be little tweaks there. So like in Alabama, for example, like a drive-by shooting is a capital murder. So what makes something a capital murder can definitely be influenced by other events that happen that can lead to the legislature passing something to become capital. But when I think about what I want people to know about and think about is, even though there are definitely fewer death sentences and fewer executions, there are still a lot of people on death row in Texas, and a lot of people doing a lot of hard work on cases. Still, even more people needed to be doing work on these cases. And so, even though we aren't, or not we, I hear about them a lot, but most people don't hear about them all the time, the death penalty is still very relevant, because there are still people who, even if they are, they don't have execution dates, they're eligible for execution dates. It means that, something, depending on what happens, what year it is, that they are eligible for execution. And so it's definitely not an issue to be ignored, especially here in Texas. And depending on who is in power, depending in a BA's office and AG's office, that can definitely affect what happens. And so it's something to still pay attention to. The other part about something contributing to why there are fewer death sentences, as I mentioned mitigation specialists. They're just such a huge part of what's happening. So even though there aren't as many, it's not because some of it I think is just like a less interest in the death penalty because of hearing about exonerations. So there have been around, I think, 200 people exonerated from death row for lots of different reasons. Not a lot of people think about DNA, but there's like misconduct by prosecutors, false confessions. Those are things that people are getting exonerated from. And so, yeah, just about, those are some things to consider, that it's still an ongoing issue, and that if people aren't getting dates or getting executed, if they're on death row, they're on death row. There's still the prospect of them getting death sentences, and so you can't forget about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of blows in the political winds, doesn't it? So you're still very vulnerable. Remember when it used to be a bigger issue? Every presidential debate.
Oh yeah.
Dukakis probably lost. Well, he lost the election
For a lot of
other
reasons.
things. But that was a big one.
But there was
if Kitty
in
was
92,
murdered, would you? He's like, I'm still
in
not-
92, Bill Clinton flew home from the campaign trail to
Yeah.
Arkansas to oversee an execution.
Right.
Tragic. Look that story up. It's a sort of tragic.
But yeah,
all the
just
way
to
around.
show
But-
how he's not going to be one of these soft on crime.
Yeah, it was sort
Democrats.
of to kind of overcorrect
Yeah.
for the impression that Dukakis gave.
I mean, yeah, you have to kind of. Oh, sorry.
Oh no. I do think that there is a bit of a shift also now. Donald Trump, I think, has made the death penalty more front and center than the last few presidents, even Republican presidents. And so there was an executive order that came out among many, so it was easy to not notice this one. But it was arguing for seeking the death penalty in all cases where a law enforcement officer has been killed or the perpetrator is an undocumented immigrant. There's going to be sticky questions, I think, about whether some of these cases can be made into federal cases as opposed to state cases. There's like a wonky jurisdictional question. But I think we're living in this kind of moment where there's a real question mark around what happens next, whether there really is a national effort to rev it up or whether this is sort of campaign bluster.
Yeah, I think they largely want it to go away. Like our governor, I think he's less vocal. He's still doing it, but like on the Cantu case I keep talking about, he wouldn't take a phone call from like a big movie star or anything. He's just like, he's not accepting phone calls on this issue. It's like, okay, so it's a bummer subject for them. I think I think it'd do everyone a favor if it just kind of went away.
Anyone else? Over here? Yeah?
You spoke earlier about ineffective assistance of trial counsel. Is there any review board standards for just any attorney take those cases?
No, so there are standards for who can take on cases, who can be appointed on them, and if you have been found ineffective, you are not supposed to be able to take one, take one again. But really, I mean, I feel like, it's iffy because sometimes I think that with the way our system works makes it difficult to collaborate with I think if appellate attorneys and post-conviction attorneys could actually collaborate with trial attorneys where they didn't feel like they were where they were being threatened when it came to issues of ineffectiveness, I think that it would work better. Because when we think of generally people will think ineffectiveness as like the sleeping lawyer, but there are things that are where you might try and claim ineffectiveness that from the outside someone might not see it as ineffective, but we'd want to be able, if we could work as like post-conviction and appellate attorneys, if we could work with trial attorneys to kind of get to them about their thinking about how they made a certain conclusion about what strategy to approach, it would be that would be useful. But yeah, so if you're found ineffective, you're not supposed to be able to take those cases on, and to take the cases on, there are certain standards you should meet, but those vary by administrative judicial region, which is several counties grouped together, and those are different, and it's different by year. So there are people who are on the road now, or people who have life sentence or other kinds of sentences who got convicted capitally, who their lawyers were under a completely different standard. Like I represented someone in a parole hearing who, because of when he got convicted, he got a life with parole sentence, and the first attorney that he had had graduated from law school like 18 months before he took on that capital case. So there are people who are incarcerated now who had that kind of representation and like now that wouldn't happen, but they're there.
I think we have time for one more, particularly short one. Back left corner, my left.
Interestingly enough, I think there's like certain states that have capital punishment for non-murder related crimes like treason or drug trafficking. I think in Texas, it's second conviction of rape under the age of 14. And I'm just curious if in your work studies, what have you, you've come across any type of case where capital punishment was considered? And if not, why wouldn't the local legislatures or federal legislatures remove those if they're no longer being considered?
Well, yeah, constitutionally, that you cannot be you can't get the death penalty for a non-homicide offense. I know there's been discussions about trying to bring laws like that back, or because I forget, I don't remember the year, but it used to be that people got death penalty for rape, for example. And so I know people have been trying to push for that, but I don't think it would ever, hopefully, be.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I know, right?
I mean, the Supreme Court said that, but my understanding is that, like Florida passed a law, for example, to bring it back, hoping that would lead the Supreme Court to change the constitutional.
Yeah, I mean, I think even with the Supreme Court we have now, I think that would be unlikely. Yeah, but it's scary that people want to even do that.
Historically, if you want to you can look up everyone who's ever been executed in Texas. If you go back to the 1800s, even early 90s, and the reasons, it's almost comical.
Like cattle theft?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just petty theft, anything.
Right.
You can almost feel like, we just don't like you.
Yeah, what you do see in cases sometimes these days is something called the law of parties, where like multiple people committed a crime together, but the like, let's say the getaway driver, so to speak, receives the death penalty.
The person who pulled the trigger gets plea bargains or testifies against the other, whatever.
You
This
see all
can
kinds
get really
of scenarios.
nasty.
Yeah.
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 Again, arbitrary, unfair.
Well, I think we have run to the end, so thank you all so much for coming. We're going to be around for another another hour or so. There's refreshments, and come say hello to us, and we can obviously try to answer more questions. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Johnny didn't ask any questions.
What?
Johnny didn't ask any questions.